In the spring of 1943, the United States Army tested a weapon designed by a dentist from Irwin, Pennsylvania. The weapon was a Mexican free-tailed bat carrying a 17-gram napalm device tied to its chest. A single test aircraft carried 5,000 of them. Expert analysis concluded that full-scale deployment could ignite more than 3,600 simultaneous fires across a Japanese city in a single night. The man who designed it had no military background, no chemistry training, and no weapons experience. He had been on holiday in the Southwest. The idea came to him while watching bats emerge from a cave. Lytle Silas Adams was born in 1886 in Irwin, a small borough in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, and had practiced dentistry in the town for more than 2 decades. By November 1941, he had no scientific publications, no military connections, and no professional relationship with any institution of national defense or weapons research. He was a dental surgeon in his mid-50s with a considerable reputation for lateral thinking, a quality that, in the weeks following Pearl Harbor, would turn out to matter more than any military credential. He was on holiday in the American Southwest with his wife when the idea came to him. To understand it, it is necessary to begin with a cave in the Guadalupe Mountains of New Mexico and approximately 3 million bats. Carlsbad Caverns National Park, in the Guadalupe Mountains of New Mexico, was designated a national park in 1930. Its principal attraction was its cave formations, but it was also known for a nightly spectacle between May and October, the emergence of between 3 and 5 million Mexican free-tailed bats from the natural cave entrance at dusk. The colony, Tadarida brasiliensis, the most abundant bat species in North America, roosted in the cave's upper chambers during the summer months. Each evening, the emergence lasted between 20 and 40 minutes, the bats forming a continuous rotating column before dispersing southward toward feeding grounds in the Chihuahuan Desert. Adams and his wife visited in late November 1941, outside the main season, but enough of the colony remained in the cave for the flight to be visible. He stood at the entrance for 20 minutes. He took his notebook out. What Adams wrote in that notebook was not about bats. It was about buildings. Japanese residential construction used post and beam timber framing with paper screen walls and tiled roofing, a construction type approximately 80% combustible by mass. The structural design created specific voids, the space between the roof tiles and the ceiling boards, the gap between external cladding and interior screens, the space above the ceiling joists. These voids were accessible from the exterior through the eave gap, a continuous opening where the roof projection met the external wall. A bat approaching a Japanese structure at dawn would find that opening and use it. It would be inside the structural frame before anyone in the building knew it was there. An incendiary device set to ignite after roosting would be burning inside the ceiling void, invisible, unreachable, past the point where fire services could reach it before it reached the primary timber members. Adams was not designing an explosion. He was designing a fire that started where nobody thought to look. Adams was still in the Southwest when the news came. On 7 December 1941, driving from New Mexico back toward Pennsylvania, he heard the announcement of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on his car radio. He continued driving. He also continued writing. The connection was straightforward. The Japanese had created an urgent problem. The United States needed an unconventional solution, and he had just watched the solution emerge from a cave in a rotating column. He was not an explosives expert. He was not a military strategist. He was a dental surgeon who had spent 20 years understanding problems in terms of the specific enclosed spaces in which they occurred, and the limited access points through which solutions could be delivered. The notes he was writing were about fire. Back in Pennsylvania, Adams spent 3 weeks formalizing his notes into a detailed 5-page proposal document. He submitted it to the White House on 12 January 1942, 36 days after Pearl Harbor, forwarding it through Eleanor Roosevelt, who had met Adams on a previous occasion, and Lieutenant Colonel James F.T. Lee of the Army Air Force. The proposal specified the bat species, described their hibernation behavior, outlined the flammability of Japanese urban construction, and set out the mathematical case. Bats released over a Japanese city at altitude, each carrying a small incendiary device on a timed delay, would produce more simultaneous fire sources than any conventional bombing mission could achieve. President Roosevelt's response, forwarded to the War Department with his marginal note attached, the proposal was worth investigating in detail. Carlsbad Caverns National Park, late November 1941. The bat flight had been flowing for 20 minutes when Adams arrived at the cave entrance. Tens of thousands of bats per minute poured from the cave's mouth in a continuous dark stream that rose and banked southward above the desert scrub. Adams stood at the railing. He had a notebook open. He was not writing about the bats. He was writing about buildings. How wide was the eave gap in standard Japanese wood frame construction? Wide enough for a bat at dusk. How high did bats seek roosting sites? Below the eave line, below where anyone would look. What was the construction density in Osaka? Buildings per city block. roosting voids per building, fire sources per bat. He wrote figures, crossed some out, and wrote others. The column of bats continued to emerge. He was not watching them as a naturalist watches them. He was watching them as a man who had spent 20 years understanding enclosed spaces and the limited access points through which things entered them. The proposal reached the National Defense Research Committee within weeks of submission. The NDRC referred it to the Army Chemical Warfare Service and commissioned an independent biological assessment. Dr. Donald R. Griffin of Cornell University, whose work on bat echolocation had established the principles of chiropteran navigation, was appointed to evaluate the delivery concept. Griffin's assessment, completed in the spring of 1942, confirmed the biological case. Mexican free-tailed bats could carry a payload of approximately 18 grams, roughly equal to their own body weight. Without significant impairment of flight or ability, they roosted in enclosed spaces by instinct and would continue to do so while carrying an attached device. The NDRC authorized Phase 1 funding in March 1942. A dental surgeon's proposal had survived the scrutiny of the United States military scientific establishment. The work of designing the weapon began. The question the NDRC's authorization had left open was not whether bats could carry incendiary devices into the structural voids of Japanese buildings. Griffin's assessment had established that they could. The question was whether a device small enough to fall within the bat's carry capacity, 18 grams, the weight of a large coin, could generate sufficient sustained heat to establish a structural fire from inside a ceiling void. Answering that question required a chemist. It required specifically the chemist at Harvard who had spent the previous year developing the incendiary compound that would become the defining weapon of the Pacific Air Campaign. His name was Louis Fieser. He had, 3 months earlier, invented napalm. He had not yet been asked what he could do with 18 grams of it. The answer would take him 6 months to produce and would fit inside a matchbox. Project X-ray, as the program was formally designated in 1942, presented 3 engineering problems that had to be solved before any field testing could take place. The first was the incendiary device itself. What compound, at what mass, in what container, delivered sufficient heat output to ignite a structural timber from inside a ceiling void on a reliable time delay. The second was the delivery mechanism, how to transport living bats in a combat aircraft at altitude without killing them, and how to release them in a condition where they would fly, navigate, and roost. The third was scale. What combination of aircraft type, bat load, and release altitude produced the fire start density across a target city that Adams's proposal had calculated? Each problem had a specific answer. The answers took 14 months to assemble. The incendiary device was assigned to Louis Fieser of Harvard. Fieser had developed napalm, a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acid soaps combined with gasoline, for the United States military in 1942, producing an incendiary compound that clung to surfaces and burned at sustained high temperature. His task for Project X-ray was to miniaturize the principle. The device he produced consisted of a celluloid tube approximately 3 centimeters in length, containing 17 grams of napalm gel, a spring-loaded timer mechanism, triggered by a pull pin that released on roosting, ran for a preset interval before igniting a small fuse. The entire assembly weighed 17 grams. It attached to the bat's chest via a surgical clip threaded through a fold of loose skin near the sternum, a technique that Fieser derived from standard laboratory animal restraint methods. The device added no perceptible drag. The bat could fly, navigate, and roost with it attached. The delivery problem was solved by a mechanism Adams had identified in his original proposal, and Griffin's biological assessment had confirmed. Mexican free-tailed bats enter physiological torpor, a state of dramatically reduced metabolic activity, when their body temperature drops below approximately 15 degrees Celsius. In torpor, the bat's heart rate falls from 200 beats per minute to fewer than 10. Oxygen consumption drops by more than 90%. The animal can remain in this state for weeks without feeding. By packing bats into cardboard trays of 40 individuals each and refrigerating the trays to 4 degrees Celsius before loading, the Army Chemical Warfare Service could transport living animals in the cargo bays of bombers for the duration of a mission. Each tray was suspended inside a cylindrical bomb casing on a small parachute. At a preset altitude, the casing opened and released the trays. As the trays descended into warmer air, the bats began to warm and rouse. By the time they reached the altitude at which bats naturally seek roosting sites, between 1,000 and 2,000 feet, they were fully awake and navigating toward the nearest enclosed structure. The scale calculation was the part of the proposal that most alarmed the Army Air Force and the part that most interested the NDRC. A single B-29 Superfortress, using its full internal capacity, could carry 200 bomb casings. Each casing held 28 cardboard trays of 40 bats. That was 224,000 bats per aircraft. though operational loading was reduced to allow for safety margins, placing the working figure at approximately 5,000 bats per aircraft. A mission of 100 B-29s carried 500,000 bat bomb systems. A planned full-scale mission of 1,040 aircraft, approximately the force that General LeMay would use against Tokyo in March 1945, carried approximately 5.2 million bat bomb systems over the target area in a single night. Adams's original proposal had calculated that approximately 1 in 4 bats successfully roosts inside a structure before the device ignites. At that rate, 1.3 million simultaneous interior structure fires from a single mission. The conventional incendiary bombing missions that the Army Air Force was planning against Japan in the same period used a different arithmetic. The M69 incendiary cluster bomb, the primary weapon of the Pacific Fire campaign, produced between 400 and 800 individual fire sources per aircraft on a standard mission. Against a target city, a 300-aircraft mission produced between 120,000 and 240,000 fire start locations, externally on rooftops and in streets, where fire services could deploy resources and establish control lines. The bat bomb produced interior fires, distributed throughout the structural fabric of the city. The distinction was not merely one of scale. Interior fires are not visible until they have already compromised the primary structural frame. A city fire service responding to 1.3 million interior fire calls simultaneously has no triage strategy that functions. Louis Fieser's laboratory at Harvard. Winter 1942 to 1943. The prototype devices were lined up in a row on the bench, 30 of them, each 3 centimeters long, each containing 17 grams of napalm gel and a timer mechanism machined to a tolerance of plus or minus 2 seconds across the full range of operating temperatures the devices would encounter between the refrigerated bomb casings and the interior of a Japanese ceiling void at summer ambient temperature. Fieser had a problem. The original celluloid casing fractured on impact with hard surfaces if the bat dropped rather than roosted. He had modified the wall thickness twice. The current iteration survived a 1-meter drop onto a concrete floor without fracturing. He ran the drop test for the 30th device. It survived. He wrote in his laboratory notebook, "Casing integrity confirmed across full test series." He did not note that the device weighed less than a large coin. He noted the tolerance and the test count. Those were the numbers that mattered. The Marine Corps assumed operational control of Project X-ray in late 1943, redesignating it under Marine Corps jurisdiction and assigning Colonel William Cabridge to oversee field testing. The transfer reflected the Army's assessment that the program had moved past the conceptual phase and into the final development stage before deployment trials. Testing was scheduled at 2 sites: the Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico for initial live animal trials, and Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where the Army maintained purpose-built test facilities, including replica foreign structures. A replica Japanese village had been under construction at Dugway since late 1942. Built to the specification of Japanese residential and commercial construction by architect Antonin Raymond, who had worked in Japan before the war and understood its structural characteristics. The village was ready, the bats were ready, the devices were ready. What remained was to establish, under controlled field conditions, whether the system worked as Adams had calculated it would from the railing at Carlsbad Caverns in November 1941. The field test that followed would produce 2 results. One was expected, one was not, and it involved a United States Army General's staff car, a fuel storage tank, and a question about who exactly was responsible for ensuring that armed incendiary devices attached to living animals were adequately secured before the animals were placed into transport containers. The answer to that question was the first documented evidence that the bat bomb worked. The first live test of Project X-ray took place at Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico in May 1943. On the second day of trials, a container of bats carrying armed incendiary devices was accidentally released before the intended test area. The bats roused from torpor in the desert heat and dispersed across the airfield. Most landed without incident, 2 did not. One roosted under a fuel storage tank on the south perimeter. Another roosted in the wheel arch of a general's staff car parked outside the operations building. Both devices ignited on their timers. The tank sustained fire damage. The staff car burned. The Army filed both events as equipment loss. It was the first confirmation that the bat bomb functioned as Adams had specified it would from the railing at Carlsbad Caverns in November 1941. What the Carlsbad incident confirmed was a point Adams had argued theoretically, and that no military reviewer had been willing to accept without evidence. Bats carrying armed incendiary devices behaved identically to bats carrying nothing. They roosted in enclosed spaces. They selected sheltered locations, beneath a tank, inside a wheel arch, rather than exposed surfaces. The roosting instinct functioned independently of the additional weight. The devices activated on FISA's specified timer. No alarm was raised until the fires were already established, because no one had known the bats were present. No protocol had directed them to those structures. The two bats had simply done what bats do at dawn: found the most sheltered available space and entered it. The damage was the answer to the question the Army had been asking since March 1942. Testing moved to WWII. WWII Proving Ground, Utah, was the Army's principal weapons testing facility in the western United States, a 900,000-acre installation in the western desert, where controlled conditions made it possible to conduct tests that could not be run anywhere else. For Project X-Ray, the relevant installation was a replica Japanese village constructed on the test range to the precise architectural specification of traditional Japanese residential and commercial buildings. The architect commissioned to design the structures was Antonin Raymond, a Czech-American who had spent 17 years working in Japan before the war and understood its construction techniques in exact detail. The village comprised a range of structure types: single-story residential, two-story commercial, and mixed-use buildings, all built with post and beam timber framing, paper screen walls, and tiled roofing. The village was complete by June 1943. It was accurate. It was ready to burn. The WWII tests were conducted in late May and June 1943. Bat bomb casings were released from aircraft at altitude over the test range. The bats roused during descent, dispersed toward the target structures as the aircraft departed, and roosted in the eave voids and ceiling spaces of the replica buildings. Incendiary devices were set to a 30-minute delay from roosting. Observers at the safety perimeter watched through binoculars. Of 30 target structures in the first test series, 30 caught fire. The fire start rate was 100%. 17 of the 30 fires were classed as structural, meaning the fire had penetrated the primary timber frame before suppression was possible under normal conditions. The remaining 13 were surface fires that would, in an uncontrolled urban environment, have spread to adjacent structures before fire services could establish a perimeter. The Army test report stated the result in one sentence: the system worked. The NDRC analysis that followed produced the figure that would define Project X-Ray's operational potential. Based on the WWII fire start rate, extrapolated to a full-scale mission, the committee calculated that a deployment of 1,040 B-29s, each carrying approximately 200 bomb casings, each containing 40 bats, would release approximately 8.3 million bat bomb systems over a target city in a single night. Applying a conservative fire start rate of 1 in 4, the calculated result was 3,625 simultaneous interior structure fires. For comparison, a conventional Army Air Force incendiary raid of the same period, using M69 cluster bombs, produced between 400 and 800 fire sources per aircraft. The bat bomb produced 10 times that density per aircraft, and every fire it started was inside a building rather than on its surface. Interior fires are not visible until they have compromised the primary structural frame. Fire services responding to 3,625 simultaneous calls have no effective triage strategy. The safety perimeter at WWII was 400 meters from the nearest target structure. An officer stood at the perimeter on the morning of 15 June 1943 with binoculars and a field notebook. The bats had been released 40 minutes earlier from bomb casings at 2,000 feet. The structures had been quiet since the release. At the 32-minute mark, smoke appeared at the eave junction of a target structure, a two-story replica residential building, timber frame, paper walls, tile roof. Not from a surface the observer could see, from inside the eave void, where the fire was burning before it was visible. The smoke thickened. A small flame emerged along the roofline, then a second flame, 2 meters along the same eave gap, from a second roosting site. The observer wrote the time in his notebook. He looked down the row of 29 remaining target structures. Smoke was rising from 11 of them. He set down his binoculars. The calculation Adams had run at the railing at Carlsbad Caverns was, within the margin of rounding, correct. The cancellation order was issued in March 1944. 2 reasons were given. The Manhattan Project was expected to produce a war-ending weapon within 12 to 18 months, and General H. Arnold of the Army Air Forces preferred a conventional bombing approach under direct military command over a system whose final delivery phase depended on living animals. Neither reason engaged with the test results from WWII. Adams was informed that the program was 3 to 6 months from operational deployment at the time the cancellation was issued. He had been developing the weapon for 25 months. The Project X-Ray documentation, test reports from WWII Proving Ground, NDRC assessments, and Army Air Force cancellation correspondence is held in the declassified records at the National Archives, College Park, Maryland. Adams never saw those internal documents. What they record about what his project would have done to Japanese cities is the question this account has not yet fully answered. The 8th Air Force's conventional bombing program against Germany had established by the autumn of 1943 that unescorted precision daylight bombing was operationally unsustainable. The Army Air Force's solution was the P-51 escort fighter. Adams' solution to the same fundamental problem, how do you deliver a weapon to a target without losing the delivery vehicle, was not a faster aircraft. It was a delivery vehicle that German radar could not detect, that anti-aircraft artillery could not track, and that Japanese air defense fighters could not intercept. It weighed 18 grams. It navigated by echolocation. It had been doing the job independently every night for 3 million years before anyone thought to attach 17 grams of napalm to its sternum. The question that remained was what that weapon would have done had it been used. That is what the final section of this account examines. The dental surgery of Lytle Adams in Irwin, Pennsylvania, occupied a suite of 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of a commercial building on Main Street. On an afternoon in the autumn of 1944, Adams sat at his desk between patient appointments with an Army letter in his hand. He had been expecting it. The letter confirmed the termination of Project X-ray, with effect from March 1944. The active testing phase had concluded. No deployment was planned. Adams read the letter. He read the relevant paragraph a second time. He folded the letter along its creases. His next patient was scheduled in 8 minutes. He placed the letter in his desk drawer and closed it. He had designed a weapon that the Army's own test results had confirmed could generate 3,625 simultaneous interior structure fires in a single Japanese city on a single night. He had come within 3 to 6 months of seeing it deployed. He had been told this by the officer who delivered the termination notice. He went to wash his hands. The official reasoning behind the cancellation rested on a comparison that had not been explicitly stated in the March 1944 order, but was clear in the correspondence that preceded it. The Manhattan Project scientists had indicated to the War Department that a nuclear weapon was achievable within 12 to 18 months. Against that timeline, the $2 million cost and 14 months of additional development required to bring Project X-ray to operational deployment looked marginal rather than decisive. General Arnold's preference for conventional bombing was also documented. He did not want a weapon system whose terminal phase he could not control. A bat that took an unexpected course after release could not be recalled. A bomb dropped from a B-29 went where the bombardier aimed it. That distinction mattered to Arnold. It did not appear in the WWII test reports, which said nothing about control. They said the system worked. What the tests had actually established was more precise than the Army's summary of them acknowledged. The WWII fire start rate of 100% across 30 structures was not a promising preliminary result. It was a confirmed operational capability. The 17-gram napalm device burned reliably within its specified timer tolerance. Across the full range of ambient temperatures the test structures produced, the bats roosted in exactly the structural voids Adams had identified from the railing at Carlsbad, the ceiling space above the joist line, the eave void beneath the tile overhang, the gap between the exterior cladding and the interior screen. The fires they started were invisible from the exterior for between 12 and 18 minutes after ignition, by which time the primary structural members were already involved. A fire service arriving at a structure in that condition cannot prevent structural failure. It can only manage the spread to adjacent buildings, which, in a Japanese city of average construction density, were between 2 and 4 meters distant. The comparison the cancellation prevented can be made with precision, because the conventional alternative was executed 14 months later. On the night of 9 to 10, March 1945, General LeMay dispatched 279 B-29s against Tokyo in Operation Meeting House, the single most destructive air raid in human history. The aircraft carried M69 incendiary clusters. They dropped from low altitude to improve accuracy. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned. Between 80,000 and 100,000 people died. 1 million were made homeless. The fires were started on rooftops and in streets and merged into a single conflagration that overwhelmed the Tokyo Fire Service entirely. Meeting House used 279 aircraft. The bat bomb mission that the NDRC had calculated would produce 3,625 simultaneous interior fires required 1,040 B-29s. A larger force, but one whose fires would have been distributed through the structural fabric of the city, rather than concentrated on its surface. Interior fires in individual buildings are harder to merge into a single conflagration. They are also harder to fight, harder to see, and harder to evacuate from. The insight Adams had applied to the problem was not military in origin, it was dental. A dental surgeon spends a professional career working within enclosed spaces, the human oral cavity, whose structural properties determine what interventions are possible, and through which access points those interventions must be delivered. The mouth is a small space with a limited number of entry routes, a specific geometry of surfaces, and a predictable pattern of failure modes when its structural integrity is compromised at specific points. Adams had spent 20 years identifying the access route, selecting the correct intervention for the specific structural condition, and delivering it to the exact location where it would be most effective. The bat bomb was the same analysis applied to a different enclosed space. The access route was the eave gap. The intervention was a 17-gram napalm device. The structural condition was Japanese timber construction at ambient temperature. The delivery mechanism was an animal that made the journey every night by instinct. The timing argument is arithmetic. The Manhattan Project's Trinity test, the first successful detonation of a nuclear device, took place on 16 July 1945. The atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on 6 August 1945 and on Nagasaki on 9 August 1945. Project X-ray was confirmed operational at WWII in June 1943 and was, by the Army's own estimate, 3 to 6 months from deployment when it was cancelled in March 1944. That places the earliest possible deployment date for the bat bomb at September 1944. 11 months before Hiroshima, the Manhattan Project had no confirmed operational weapon until July 1945. The dentist from Irwin, Pennsylvania, had a confirmed operational weapon more than a year before the physicists at Los Alamos did. The decision to cancel Project X-ray in favor of the Manhattan Project was made on the basis of a projected timeline. The projection was accurate. The bat bomb timeline was also accurate. They were not in conflict. Both could have been developed. Only one was. None of this was visible to Adams in the autumn of 1944 as he placed the cancellation letter in his desk drawer. He did not know the precise state of the Manhattan Project. He did not know that the atomic bomb would not be tested until July 1945. 11 months after his program had been terminated in its favor, he knew that his weapon had worked, that the Army's own tests had confirmed it worked, and that it had been cancelled for reasons that had nothing to do with whether it worked. He had designed the delivery system around a behavior that 3 million bats had been performing every night. In complete darkness, at navigational accuracies measured in centimeters, since before any human building existed that they could be asked to enter. The question he had answered in his notebook at Carlsbad, how does a Japanese city destroy itself, had a correct answer. He had found it. His next patient was waiting. Little Adams submitted his proposal on 12th January 1942, 5 weeks after watching the bats emerge from Carlsbad caverns. He had no military background, he had no chemistry training, he had no weapons design experience. He was a dental surgeon who had observed an animal behavior and asked one question the military establishment had not yet asked. Not how do you destroy a Japanese city, but how a Japanese city destroys itself. The bats were already flying into Japanese rooflines every night. They already roosted in the spaces where a small incendiary caused maximum damage. He had not invented the weapon, he had noticed that it was already there, waiting to weigh 17 grams. The dentist from Irwin, Pennsylvania, came closer to burning Tokyo than the Army Air Force's conventional bombing program had managed by the end of 1944. He had seen it coming at Carlsbad, watching a cloud of bats disappear into the dark.